Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby, and today I'm joined by Vanesa Weyrauch and Leandro Echt. Vanesa's work in policy and research has been particularly focused on think tanks in the global south. In 2012, she co-founded the consultancy Purpose and Ideas, which supports organisations and individuals interested in strengthening the use of evidence in policy by using co-creative methods. Among many past projects, she created and developed an online platform to offer courses for researchers and policymakers in how to influence policy, communicate research, and assess impact. And Leandro is an associate within Purpose and Ideas. He has a background in political science, public policy, evaluation, and gender. He focuses on supporting government agencies, NGOs, and international organisations to use evidence in their decision-making. And he's worked in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, West Africa, Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, and South Asia. So, Vanesa and Leandro, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Purpose and Ideas is a pretty vague name, I have to say, for a consultancy. And it sounds like you have quite a particular focus on knowledge and policymaking. So why that name? Where did it come from?
That's a good question. We used to be called Politics and Ideas. And what we decided after decades of working in interaction between knowledge and policy is to focus more on the purpose, like the process of doing this, where we find the potential is. So what we're trying to focus on the purpose, what we mean is, what do you want to get out of this effort, of this project, of this initiative, of this space? And we think that one of the most promising ways forward is generating spaces that can activate collective intelligence, like weaving together different stakeholders who care about the link between science and policy, and which are the realistic ways forward in terms of developing a culture or putting a very specific piece of evidence into a decision-making process.
Yes, I think one of the main reasons why we change our name and emphasize the purpose is because when you work with different stakeholders, we notice that very quickly people and organizations want to run into what we have to do, how do we improve, how do we become better in what we do. And one step back that we thought would be very important was, okay, what do you want to do? Let's connect with the purpose of your work. And from there, try to understand how can you do it better.
All right, but despite the name change from politics to purpose, you do still focus on politics, right? Or at least politics and policy
making. And the
politics
of policy as well. That's why we started calling ourselves politics as well. Policies making implies a lot of politics. And I think we need to include politics in the equation.
Okay, that's interesting because there's often a distinction made there. You know, people often talk about politics being the level of public debate and elections and executive decision-making and legislation. So that's the domain that politicians operate in. As opposed to policy making, which can cover, officials, technocrats, bureaucrats, the people who draft the rules and advise politicians and so on. But from what you just said, it sounds like you see politics throughout at all levels.
Totally more in the South. I think that it's quite messy and intertwined. And I think that we need to talk more about the politics because they significantly affect even the technical and bureaucratic processes that seem to be more neutral. In fact, what we are going to talk about today and our framework brings all these sort of also invisible forces that are affecting the whole cycle, right?
Good. Well, thank you for throwing me that perfect segue. So yes, I do want to ask you about this framework you've created, and I hope we'll discuss what that actually means, by the way, called Context Matters. I presume this is like context matters when we make policy, or context matters when we communicate evidence or something like that. So my first question is the obvious one. What do you mean? Why does context matter?
Well, I think we all understand that phrase, right? When we say context matter, I think that practitioners, researchers who are doing this, policymakers would nod their heads, acknowledging how fundamental context is, and it's always present when trying to explain how some interventions, projects have worked or not, and yield to some concrete results. So what we found is that we tend to regard context more of like an explanatory factor to account for some cases where a piece of evidence or a body of knowledge successfully or unsuccessfully a specific policy. So we refer to this context as a sort of external events, a large and broad world of events where we tend to have no control. And even though this is true in some way, we believe that we are part of that context, and that by understanding it better, we can interact with those forces in a different way. So at Purpose and Ideas, we've been interested in always in promoting the co-generation of new knowledge. And we thought that this is a good time to expand the discussion and understanding of what do we mean when we say context matters. What is that, and how can we unravel that big black box in a way that can significantly and positively affect our work towards the use of evidence in policy?
So then the idea is that context isn't always out of our control, or doesn't need to be. It's not always so external that we can't affect it, right? That we can try to account for it rather than just shrugging and saying, oh, well, I guess our policy didn't work or our evidence was unhelpful because context.
Exactly. And make it not an ex post reflection, but an ex ante, right? Ideally, to think about, okay, what could be the weight and role of context in this new thing or in the work that I've been doing? The idea is that we don't leave it to the end to have that reflection about context, but start earlier on.
Yeah, all right. Good. Well, I agree with you that we do often hear people saying context matters, usually after they've failed to get results they expected from a particular policy intervention or whatever. But I get the feeling actually when different people say that, they are using the word context in lots of very different ways. You know, was it social context or political context or linguistic context or historical context or I don't know what, altitude or communication or whatever, the list goes on. And to try and gloss all those different things under one definition, the only definition I can really think of to make sense of it would be something like context is whatever messed up our plans that we forgot to take into account when we started. So then when you say in the abstract you study context and you've worked on this framework to help people handle context, what are you actually talking about?
That's a great question, Toby. Indeed, it's a question that we had at the very beginning as well. I mean, we couldn't start doing this without trying to find a definition, because we also saw that the use of context had different meanings and was used in very different ways. So to define it itself was a challenge. And part of our contribution through this framework was to start trying to define it. And based on the available literature, how we decided to use context is context in our study refers to the specific environment in which persons are trying to get research, evidence, and knowledge into practice. So in a very simplistic way, we could think this is a physical environment where this takes place, but it also encompasses and includes the relationships and the processes that go beyond that physical environment that in this case would be the government agency. And we know that in many cases, policies are part of an interaction of more than one government agency. So those interrelationships and the government agencies would be the context where the use of evidence takes place or not, right? So one could think about different rings, and we didn't want to leave that complexity out. And we can talk about later about the dimensions of the framework and how this is included in the lens itself, so as to not leave it as vague, but also acknowledge that when we think about context, it is a fluid thing, and set some boundaries and look at some connections so as to keep it simple, but acknowledge complexity at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's good, but let's talk about it now. I think it would be helpful to have some concrete examples of what your framework actually does. So what situations it's designed to help with.
Yeah, so for our framework, we understand that there are 6 main dimensions that can help us understand the context in which policy making is made and to which evidence can contribute. These 6 dimensions are categorized in 2 main categories. we have identified external dimensions and internal dimensions. The first external dimension is what we call the macro context, and the second external dimension is what we call relationships, or more specific, intra and interrelationships. The macro context is the bigger picture in which policy is made. It includes elements such as the political, economical, social, and cultural factors that surround and in some way determine how a government agency made decisions, and is the context in which this government agency and other sister organizations are embedded.
Just to add to that, this is what a traditional political and economical analysis would do, that many of the practitioners sometimes use this kind of macro level analysis. And a way to kind of picture this that would be useful is to imagine this as a lens that has the dimensions would be parts of that lens. So the dimensions are things you could look at specifically, and the external dimensions are the ones that are outside the government agency and this physical environment that we talked about, where the policymaking takes place, and the internal account to explaining what happens within the government agency. So it's different lenses that can be combined through a general framework. But I think that the thinking about this as lenses is useful. So you're looking at a complex reality, and we're bringing lenses into different pieces of that large puzzle.
Okay, that's helpful. And Leandro, you were talking about the external dimensions.
So the second external dimension refers to relationships between the government agency and other related public organizations on the one hand, but also to the interaction with other relevant producers and users of knowledge or evidence in that specific policy area in which the agency performs. Sometimes we call these the knowledge ecosystems, and here we refer to elements such as the flow of information and evidence between different jurisdictions and levels of government, or the existence of specific epistemic communities, among other things. As I said, the framework also has other 4 internal dimensions. These internal dimensions are the culture, the organizational capacity, the management and processes, and the core resources. Very briefly, the culture refers to what's the role and significance of evidence for policymaking at the government agency, how it is valued or not valued, what are the incentives that are linked to evidence production, use, or communication. The organizational capacity refers to the expected or existing background and skills that influence how evidence is produced and taken up at the government agency, and includes elements such as leadership, senior management, but also more broadly across the staff. When we talk about management and processes, we refer to how government agencies organize their work to achieve their mission and goals, from planning to evaluation, and in particular, how these affect the way evidence interact with policy discussions and decision making. For instance, under this dimension, we could look at elements such as work division within the agency, the roles and responsibilities related to evidence processes, or the existence of planning, monitoring, evaluation, and learning practices that favor evidence sharing, use, and communication. The final dimension then is about the set of resources that the government agency counts on to support the use of evidence in decision making, and includes elements such as budget allocation, knowledge infrastructure, and others.
Let me add to that these 4 dimensions, the last ones that are more internal, maybe sometimes in some interventions it might be very difficult to assess and to have all the right information about that. Maybe you are starting a relationship with a government agency and you just have a memorandum of understanding and some willingness from a policymaker or a couple of policymakers to do some work together or to use some piece of your knowledge if you're a practitioner. But still there within the conversations and as evolving the relationship, bearing in mind these dimensions that will influence the work together, one can start making some questions and gradually trying to understand how these factors could affect a joint effort, for instance. So we understand that these dimensions are very complete, and sometimes we don't have the time or the accessibility to all the information, but we know that they bear weight and that they influence that interaction between the knowledge and the policy making. So having them as, again, a lens where you can start asking or assessing or diagnosing some of those aspects will pave the way to a more fruitful interaction.
Yeah, I can see that. If you're going into a new relationship, you can have these lenses, as you call them, in your mind so you know what to look out for. So what the framework that you've made literally is then is like a list of thoughts and list of factors that you should think about, like a checklist, a way to break down that vague idea of the context in something more specific that you can deal with and plan for.
Yeah.
Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, you're right. The only difference is that we made it a visual sort of lens to make this more appealing and easier to grasp, and not long lists. So we can share with under the podcast the link so that people can go to that lens. We spent time and invested time in how we communicated this to make it visual. And I was mentioning the different lenses because you can zoom in into some of them if you're more interested to, like one sub-dimension, and look at there. Well, I want to zoom into this. Do the whole thing? Yes. I eventually a checklist would be another way, but we organize it visually so that this makes it easier for one to start thinking about, okay, how can I use this, right? It's a device. It's as if we were having a sort of, telescope or microscope, zooming in and out of a situation and saying like, let's pay attention to this and let's look into this.
So what I would add is that the framework is not only a checklist of things a government agency and other stakeholders interacting with that government agency should take into account, but what we want to emphasize is the interrelation between these dimensions. So how does your availability in terms of resources affect how you can interact with other knowledge producers, other NGOs, think tanks in the field, or how your processes affect whether you can count on good and useful training opportunities for your staff regarding evidence use, and so on. We really emphasize the interrelation between the 6 components of the framework.
And the framework has a conceptual paper where we present all this, and also we accompanied the conceptual paper with a practical paper. We were very obsessed in producing something that could be of really real use. So that practical paper has a lot of, it's a sort of guidance with baby steps that you can make in terms of potential ways of using it and how to do it and how to build on what you find in terms of making progress. So we really want this to inform the practice and to go into that level and not only facilitate an analytical sort of exercise in terms of understanding context, but also operating on what you see.
So this then must be quite a big and complex thing in the end, because you're talking about not just analysing these dimensions, which are quite intricate and deep in themselves, and there's a lot of them, but also looking at how they interact with each other.
Exactly. And one has to prioritize there. A government agency can, looking at the whole dimensions, acknowledge we know that this one, for instance, culture, is one that we want to prioritize. So then we bring the interrelationships of the other dimensions into that specific dimension. But one can focus just on one, because otherwise, of course, it becomes as realities. It is complex. We cannot do everything. We have limited time and resources. So this lens also can help you in terms of looking at the whole, but also selecting where to start from based on a discussion and interaction with others. We also talk a lot about using this with others, not only using the lens you as a sole policymaker or a researcher, but at least having the guide, the practical guide we promote that at least you have some discussions to see how others see. So that would enable you to kind of prioritize with some ground, right? It's not what you prefer or you only see, but what others might see as well. It's complex, but at the same time, one can make strategic decisions and use it smartly. Of course, you need a smart user on the other end.
And you mentioned both policymakers and researchers. Is the framework genuinely aimed at both of those equally?
Yeah, in fact, it can be used by other groups as well. But of course, the main users would be those knowledge producers and organizations that produce knowledge that are not part of the government, but want to make their knowledge of value and to inform policymaking. And also, of course, for policymakers, usually the ones who would be doing this are sort of champions. They are the ones who want to promote capacity and culture of using evidence in their agencies. So those would be the main type of users. But I mean, this can also contribute to those who are researching the field, those who are doing research on evidence-informed policymaking, knowledge translation. There are many ways to refer to this field nowadays, science and policy. So those who are trying to understand and producing theories and evolving the field from the academic side could also inform their future research projects and unravel some of the gaps that we detected. We also propose an agenda to further this research forward. It can also be used by those who provide capacity building for state agency and policymakers, for instance, to identify which are the critical entry points and how to prioritize capacity needs and how to address them too. In consultation with different stakeholders. It can also be a very good tool for funders and donors who are trying to contribute to this field. And for instance, they could use this lens to systematize projects that they support, for instance, in a specific country and see like, oh, maybe in this country, in this region, these are the dimensions and the sub-dimensions with these dimensions that are recurrently affecting the projects that we support. So maybe we have to do something at the meta level about those factors besides supporting individual projects. So it has different users and different ways of using it, right? It can be for future research purposes. It can be used to design an intervention, as we were saying, ex ante. It can also be used while you're implementing changes, a policymaker and a researcher or a group of researchers and policymakers doing things together, and even to monitor and evaluate these sort of efforts.
Do you have concrete examples of when this framework has been used and been useful? Or is it still in the theoretical phase?
Luckily, we had several chances in the past years to use the framework in a variety of ways to support government agencies, but also multilaterals and other philanthropic foundations to improve the way they use evidence to inform decision making. For instance, I can give you a few examples that will help you and the audience understand the potential of this tool. A few years ago, in partnership with the International Network for Advancing Science and Policy, we helped the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana analyze the factors that affect the use of evidence in their organizations, and also identify areas for improvement. And we co-developed a plan for change. It was very interesting because it was one of the first time in which the framework was used. Actually, it was one of our first pilots, and we implemented a very collaborative and participatory process that convened the agency's leadership, the staff, and other civil society stakeholders in the environmental field. And we came up with recommendations to improve the use of evidence that were, in the end, incorporated into the Environmental Protection Agency's strategic plan. That was a very important experience for us because we learned about the process of implementing the framework. And in particular, we learned about the importance of working with a committed and engaged local team and leadership support. And it also demonstrated that sometimes it's not possible to use the framework as a whole with all its 6 dimensions. Sometimes, as Vanesa was saying, you have to prioritize which areas you want to focus on. And we had a similar pilot with in Peru with the Secretary for Public Administration within the Council of Ministers. Also, an example working with multilaterals, we conducted a similar evidence diagnostic for two UNICEF's regional offices in South Asia and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, which has been a great opportunity for us to learn from a very complex engineering of evidence generation, use, and communication. And in this case, too, each regional office prioritized different dimensions of the framework to focus this evidence diagnostic.
What policy area was that on? I mean, was that a specific area of UNICEF's work, or was it a more general?
No, in this case of working with UNICEF, the policy areas were related to what UNICEF does, like working with children to improve several elements of their well-being. But the interesting thing is that UNICEF work with different evidence strands or evidence functions, as they call it. For instance, research was one evidence function, evaluation was another one, and data. And they have a specific staff and processes and decision-making points for each of these functions. Understanding that process was very interesting. And in the end, of course, we came up with a way to emphasize the complementarity between all these evidence functions, and that all of them interrelating was important to become a driver of change in evidence regarding children's well-being, as UNICEF wanted to be. And more recently, just a final example, the tool was used as a more political economic analysis tool to support a philanthropic organization to determine windows of opportunity, in this case, to relate and interact with government in an advisory process or as an advisor partner.
In the case of Peru, one interesting thing was that we started trying to make more of a general diagnosis, but very soon we detected, and they were together, right, with the secretariat, that they didn't have the map of the sort of data and evidence that they produce and were using, and who were their main knowledge contributors, and how within the different areas of the secretariat that knowledge was transformed and used. So they decided to really concentrate on the processes and management as a basis. That without that map, we cannot continue on looking into other things, because it's a basic thing that we need to map out, understand, and have it clear, so as then to move into other steps. So this can take many different directions. It doesn't mean that you always have to cover, as we were saying, all the bases. Sometimes it's really helpful to identify and determine which are the foundational aspects that you need to work upon, so as to, in general and in the future, improve different interventions and projects you might have around the use of evidence and knowledge in policy.
Yeah, I think something that is important is that by using this tool with different organizations, stakeholders working in different parts of the world at different levels, in different policy areas, is that we kind of confirm that context matters in the way that evidence is generated, used, or communicated. Actually varies from organization to organization, depends on the macro context in which that organization is embedded, depends of all these internal dimensions that the framework identifies, what's the characteristics of the knowledge ecosystem, and so on. So it helps us emphasize that there is no recipe to improve the use of evidence in an organization that can apply to all stakeholders in a way, in a checklist way. We really need to get into the context and see what are the futures of that specific environment.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for the example. So there is indeed a very wide variety in even those few case studies. So not just different policy areas and different kinds of organizations, but also very different points in the policy process and the implementation process. It sounds like some were quite retrospective, so looking back at what had been done already, and others were like planning entry points, so figuring out the landscape and working out where you should start the process of bringing in evidence and policy interventions in the first place. So I guess then I have two questions about that. The first is, does the same framework really work equally well at every stage in the process? Is that by design? And secondly, I wonder if you could do this kind of analysis even earlier, for instance, as a researcher, like starting to do research that you hope will eventually be able to improve policy. Could you do this kind of analysis at the beginning to inform your methodology, or even earlier to help you decide between different research questions or different areas to investigate?
Great question. We don't have evidence, and we haven't done like so many case studies in different ways to say like the framework is more useful for X, Y, and Z. But the second point you were making resonates with our experience so far in terms of ideally trying to incorporate it at the beginning of any effort to generate knowledge to inform us a decision, because it would enable both a policymaker and or the researcher to detect in advance, right? It could inform the research questions, but also the methodology, where will be the opportunities, but also to identify early on the obstacles in terms of that type of knowledge that is being decided that needs to be generated to effectively, like who would use it, how it could be used. So it will really inform the design of any effort, and we believe that would be the ideal stage. That doesn't mean that one can make a stop within a project that is having a lot of kind of obstacles. You're maybe already implementing a policy where you have used, so there you can also kind of stop and assess very clearly where are the bottlenecks, what are the things that might be affecting the whole effort that you can start kind of adjusting, attending to, so as to move on into that process.
Yeah. I said in my introduction at the start, and I think you mentioned once or twice, that this is a framework that was kind of developed in the global south. I'm curious what you think the implications of that might be. Do you think that the content of the framework is different because of that from how it would be if it was developed, say, in Europe or elsewhere? And do you think it's therefore transferable, or is it really targeted specifically at those kinds of countries in the global south?
So the idea of the framework is very much connected with the foundations of our organization. So Purpose and Ideas, former Politics and Ideas, was created to promote effective co-generation of relevant knowledge on the links between research and policy, and with a special emphasis on Southern perspective and experiences. And specifically regarding the framework, we noted there was a significant body of relevant but also untapped experience among those working in developing countries on how to handle these contextual factors in promoting the use of evidence in policymaking, particularly among policymakers or former policymakers. And these experiences and lessons were not very much documented several years ago. So at the same time, what we noticed was a lack of interaction between individuals and organizations that were working in the same topic and producing or using evidence in the same policy areas. So all that features of the field in the Global South, it was what encouraged us to develop this framework. And I would say that the framework can be used in different regions. It's not only for the Global South, but some of the approaches and the elements that we highlight and the assumptions of how evidence processes work are very much grounded into the experience of Southern individuals and policymakers and organizations.
Right, yeah. That's what I was asking. So what exactly does that mean then? I mean, concretely, what are the implications? I realise this could perhaps be a whole episode in its own right, or maybe even a whole podcast, to be honest. It could be. But I would like to explore it at least a little and scratch the surface since I have you here, and you've obviously thought a lot about this. One thing I hear you say is that there is this kind of reservoir of expertise and experience that's largely untapped that you can use to enrich the framework. And that's good. What I'd like to know is, what's different about that compared to the presumably well-tapped, or at least better-tapped, expertise that we find in other parts of the world?
Well, both Vanessa and I have been part of the evidence-informed policymaking or decision-making for many years now. And one thing we usually share between us, but also with other colleagues, is that some of the debates and discussions that you will encounter in the literature, but also in events, workshops, and so on, are very much grounded in the experience of northern or well-resourced organizations. And sometimes there are some specific things that happen in other latitudes that are not very much taken into account and are taken for granted. For instance, the resources you have in agencies in the global south, where it is knowledge infrastructure, whether it is internet connection, whether it is the possibility to have complex databases that everybody in the agency have access to. All these things work very differently in the South compared to other better resource organizations and environments. Also, whether the stakeholders that are important to inform decision making in different contexts are of the same type, in the sense that sometimes in some regions in the South, you really need to engage with at the community level, at a very informal level, where there are not, registered organizations with, there are not charities, they don't have formal structure, but still the way policy decisions are implemented or impact at the community level is what matters, which are the gatekeepers in those communities. For instance, the importance of religious leaders or faith organizations, all that stuff deserves a specific look. And those are some of the things that we refer to when we say context matters, and the things that determine how policy is made and how evidence interacts with policy are different in different contexts.
Yeah, I in terms of the reflection, the first thing you said, Toby, about what I call the Southern wisdom and all the knowledge and experience that is available there, there is something about leveling the field. And we wanted to do a bit of that. And one implication of taking these Southern perspectives is that we detected emergent practices. We don't call them best practices. We don't like the word best, like who knows, right? But things that are emerging that might inspire others. And most of them came from the South. And we believe that this was critical also to say these sort of practices, for instance, a think tank in Kosovo, partnering with a planning agency to help some ministries develop capacity and culture of producing policy briefs, right? That's an example. Or in Peru, a consortium of research organizations co-defining an annual research agenda with some ministries of Peru to then be able to produce research from the consortium that address the gaps and the needs of those ministers. And we believe that it's important to highlight that even though there are many, as Leandro was mentioning, there are many differences in terms of many times of resources, of capacity and culture. There are seedlings and there are also good practices and emergent practices that were applied in the South and could be applied without the need of an infrastructure or a context that is not yet, maybe. So that's an implication of our approach, was to come up and reveal and kind of demonstrate there is a lot of good progress and that there are ideas that were implemented in countries that might be more similar to mine, like Argentina, where you can think like, oh yes, this could be done. That being said, probably because of the evolution of the field in the North and the South, I would assume, and the experience, like if I compare Peru and the experience in UNICEF, which is an international organization with some already evolved practices in terms of what it means to do a diagnosis, the people being available and having the time to talk with us. In Peru, it was like, yes, we should consult X, Y, and Z, but these persons they have no space in the agenda to commit to this effort. So there, I think there might be differences and as you were asking, Toby, like, this is really big. So the more precarious and the less time and resources you have for such an exercise, you will need to prioritize and to do something that is more adaptable and maybe doesn't cover all the things you would like to cover, while maybe and probably in another organizations, people have more time to commit to reflection and systematizing knowledge and doing diagnosis. In the South, we're putting off fires like all the time. And yeah, I think that's there are some differences, but this can be useful for all. And there's learning across the regions and this divide that we still talk about, and we would like to have less of that and help each other, right? And
yeah, so we're talking about, as it were, meta context. So just like as the whole point of the framework is to understand how context matters when you're putting evidence into policy, also context matters at the level of applying the actual framework itself, right?
Exactly.
And from what you've said, I think in some ways that's very simple and obvious. Like, it's easier to learn stuff from contexts that are more like yours. So if I'm in Peru, I'm going to find it easier and more direct to get ideas for improvements from countries that are like Peru in various ways, if that's Argentina or whatever, and harder from countries that are very different, like, Iceland. But another possibly interesting dimension that you were maybe hinting at the end there is whether there's knowledge that is, as it were, undiscovered or hidden away in one part of the world, which could be of use in other parts of the world. I mean, even in Iceland, they have to put out fires sometimes, and maybe some of those fires have been put out more effectively in Peru or Argentina than in Finland or Denmark. So that's what I find particularly interesting and potentially like a rich seam of new insights, if you can pull lessons from one part of the world and understand them enough to put them in a framework that then becomes transferable to very different contexts rather than just very similar contexts.
Exactly. That's a nice example, and a lot of that will emerge. I think the global challenges are also more and more in common, and the complexity of them means that's why I was mentioning that even though we still talk about North and South, the most pressing policy and human problems are shared. And that's where we believe that there's more space to bring on the Southern wisdom. But for that, we need resources. And the problem is that many times in the South, we don't have the time. Like in the North, you have Northern researchers specialized, committing time to reflect and produce. We cannot do that. And we're like surviving. We do a bit of this knowledge systematization. Then they call us to do something different. So that's where I think that larger investment in unraveling and untapping what the South can bring into the table would be, and this goes beyond the framework, but the framework was a good effort because we got the support to produce it, and we got it informed by Southern perspectives. And I'm sure there are more opportunities to use this, but also to produce new knowledge in a similar way.
Yeah, this is just a comment. I mean, don't feel obliged to answer, but by this point, I've been doing this podcast quite a long time. So I've talked to quite a lot of people who have been through this process of creating or trying to improve science advice systems. And one common thread through a lot of those conversations is that people naturally want to find ways to avoid reinventing the wheel when it comes to knowledge. You don't have to do all the research from scratch in your own setting, your own country, because, of course, people around the world have faced the same problems and done their own research, and surely you can draw on that. So the idea is that you can just take knowledge generated elsewhere and kind of plop it down in your country and apply it. But that never seems to work, or at least it's often much more complicated than that. There seems to be various barriers to picking up, for instance, a piece of science advice delivered to the European Commission in Brussels and giving that same advice then to a government in France or Romania or whatever. I guess, again, the point is context matters.
Exactly. That's why context matters. And again, that's why we don't say best practices, like, that entails that this is the best way. And I mean, this is more about what would work better. And for that, that's why we think the framework is better used early on to make this sort of lecture reading of, okay, this is a good idea. How can I adapt and make this idea of value? And the only way to do that is to ask and engage the other party to understand, this works for me, this will be a problem, and do it in a collaborative way. So yeah, totally agree with your comment, and this theme that needs to be in some way revisited, and the need to be realistic in terms of context matter when you're landing. Are we really understanding where we are landing? That's a good question for the very beginning.
Yeah, I think that learning from what works in other latitudes, context is very important, and it's part of being evidence informed when making decisions. So it is important, but at the same time, it has to speak to the reality of the context in which some decisions will be made. And there is also a broader element of equity related to that, emphasizing and validating the experience of and the way of doing things in the global south and in its countries.
Yeah, that's fair. I do want to ask you before we finish, because I gather this framework has been in place for a little while now and you've had the chance to use it in various contexts. If you're making version 2.0, what would you change or what would you add? Or perhaps you are making version 2.0, in which case, what's on the agenda?
That's a very nice question and always a good reflection for us. For sure, one thing that was not a visible matter of concern in the field of evidence-informed decision-making when we developed the framework was elements related to gender and equity. That is how gender and equity issues affect evidence processes and vice versa. This is something that came up more strongly in the evidence global community in the past years, following the debates in other disciplines as well. And with the years of use of the framework, we learn how much knowledge ecosystems and the processes of evidence-informed decision-making are affected by identity and historical inequities. For instance, what is considered valuable knowledge or evidence. In a way, the context matter framework itself was an effort to emphasize that different contexts and stakeholders have their own dynamics and challenges when seeking to inform policy with evidence. Our political statement, in a way, was that not all processes and situations should be approached with the same lens. That can lead to an invisibilization of certain inequities and power imbalances. Today, we believe that element of equity should be made more explicit in the framework. Of course, in practice, we have done it. We have been incorporating this element with much more strength. But in the formal framework, it is still a little bit more scattered through the different dimensions and not having its own weight it should have. A more explicit approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion in evidence processes, we believe would help understand better issues of representation of global southern evidence producers in their own, even in their own context, the diverse situations in terms of knowledge infrastructure in different contexts, as I was saying before, and also how certain donor practices based on patterns of familiarity or conveniences may reinforce inequities in the way knowledge gets to inform policy and the impact it has in the society in that context. So we believe emphasizing this element of equity and making it more explicitly will really improve our framework and its uses.
Yeah, that's great. I look forward to seeing it. If someone's listening to this episode and is thinking, wow, that sounds great, I could really use that in my own work, how do they go about that? How do they get hold of it? Do they buy it from you, or is it freely available, or what?
No, it's absolutely free. As I was mentioning, we can incorporate the link so that they can see the visual framework, also the two papers where all this knowledge is shared. And of course, we're always open to collaborate and work together if someone wants help in implementing, but we wanted to produce it as a public good. And in fact, we know that besides the examples that we mentioned are the ones that we participated in, but we are aware that others have used the lens on their own too, for their own efforts. And when we know them directly, sometimes we've been consulted about, and grappling with this, how to do this and that. So this can take different ways, but of course it's free and it's available. And for us, it's always good news that others use it.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, I'll put a link in the show notes. Before we finish, what else are you up to these days? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, I'm trying to promote a project that is about the politics of evidence. That's something that emerged, and that the idea, if we get the funding, with the idea is to create a Southern global consortium to produce knowledge about how politics affects evidence. Not only politics, but also things that Leandro was talking about, distribution of power, inequalities, things that we mention, but we don't make that explicit, so as to have a joint project and produce more Southern knowledge. So I'll keep you posted.
That sounds great. Does that project have a name?
Not yet. It has a long name because it's in the concept note stage. This will evolve, so I'll keep you posted. That might be also a good excuse, and also to bring some other people participating there for a podcast about this project that touches upon some of the things that you're saying. Like, I have more questions. This project nicely weaves together some of these things that we're talking about, right? That are complex but interesting too.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's talk about a future podcast episode when it's in a more mature state. Great. Well, then we are pretty much out of time, but this has been really good. I always think it's the hallmark of a good conversation that I'm going away with as many new questions as answers and lots of ideas for future things to think about. So thank you very much for the stimulating exchange, Vanesa Weyrauch and Leandro Echt.
Thank you, Toby. That was a great conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
The Science for Policy podcast is created by the Scientific Advice Mechanism to the European Commission. It's produced and presented by Toby Wardman, with additional editing by Nina Skorchak. The Scientific Advice Mechanism provides evidence-based expertise and policy recommendations to inform policymaking in the European Commission. This podcast is funded by the EU via the SAPEA Consortium. Our theme music is composed by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elisaveta Shushenko.